Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore climate action in cities with the people who are making it happen. Hosted by me, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer and sustainability educator. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Over the last 5 years, I've interviewed 122 people on the Green Urbanist podcast across something like 82 episodes that are interview-based. This includes a wide range of people involved in sustainability in the built environment, practitioners, but also campaigners, authors, researchers, community organisers, and many others. Some of them, jumping between categories and defying categories altogether. Over the course of that, of getting a chance to talk to so many people who are involved with promoting sustainability within the built environment, some clear themes have emerged about how people leverage their positions to push for systemic change in different ways. Reflecting back over this rich data set, I have come up with 5 archetypes of change makers. I'll explain what these are in a moment and how you can figure out which one you could be. But first, I just want to explain a little bit about what I mean by systems change and sustainable change. You may have seen people at climate protests holding signs that say, systems change, not climate change. Essentially, the problems that we're facing, climate change, biodiversity loss, but also problems that you might be tackling through your work as a built environment professional, like housing shortages, the housing crisis, inequality, poverty. All of these are symptoms of the systems that we live in. So we live within social, political, economic, technological systems. And for the most part, these are not optimized for human and planetary well-being. And so an outcome of those misaligned systems is that we have things like climate change. We have environmental destruction. We also have a misallocation of resources. So some people are living in poverty while others are billionaires. These are all side effects of a system that is not optimized for the outcomes that we want, which is health, happiness, equality, and a safe environment to live in. And so when we're dealing with huge systemic problems like this, it requires solutions that are equally systemic, or in other words, are about shifting the system into different states. And so when we talk about decarbonising or getting to net zero carbon, adapting to climate change, recovering biodiversity, addressing social inequality, these are systemic interventions, or we're trying to shift the systems that we live in towards states where those systems can better optimise for these outcomes that we want. I've done a couple of episodes about systems thinking, and I've had guests on, a lot of guests talk about systems work, and it's interesting how much systems change comes up in the interviews that I've done over the years. I'll point to a few of those in the episode description if you want to deepen your knowledge on these topics. Now, many people, when they come across or they start to understand this analysis of the systemic issues that we're facing, they can start to feel a bit helpless. And maybe you've experienced this as well, where you think climate change, political instability, all these things are huge problems. They're beyond what I can influence as an individual. And it can be easy to feel like your actions therefore make no difference to the systems around us. That as individuals, we're too small to change things. But I've seen over the past few years that this is not the case. The point isn't that you alone have to solve these problems. Nobody alone can solve these problems. The point is that all of us collectively taking action in many different ways, whatever ways we can, might be enough to start shifting systems in the direction that would be more favourable towards a safe environment. I appreciate that it can be difficult to see this, so I'm going to give you some examples from within our world of urbanism, built environment architecture, planning, legislation, the kind of shifts that I'm starting to see in the world, and the people, mostly the guests that have been on this podcast, the way that they're in the system trying to shift things and working within this complexity to try and shift systems as well. Before I jump into telling you about the 5 types of change makers, I want to give you a little taste of some of the systems thinking research that has really shaped my thinking on this. I think it's very common for people who are knowledgeable about climate change or are switched on to climate change and sustainability to also feel quite hopeless by the scale of the challenge. And I definitely relate to that. I've had this, this feeling in the past as well. But I think the more I learn about systems change and the role that individuals can play in it, the more I feel motivated to keep going, the more I feel, dare I say, slightly hopeful that actually things are moving in the right direction over the long term. So there's kind of three things I just want to mention really briefly here, and I'll do another episode going into more detail on these because it's really, really interesting and it's good to have more examples and that kind of thing. The first thing I want to talk about is tipping points theory. The idea with tipping points is that systems change is often not linear. If we want people to change behaviors or we want new technologies to be rolled out to the mainstream, often that doesn't happen in a linear incremental way. Things often start out that way with some pilot projects, some prototypes, some labs, some testing. But then at a certain point, if we can get the technology or the behavior adopted by enough members of the public, it starts to accelerate and then it hits a tipping point where it becomes mainstream and normalized. So this is something that's happened, all throughout history. Think about, we can go back to like the printing press. We can talk about the Industrial Revolution and the way that technology spread so quickly, along with fossil fuel use. We can talk about motor vehicle use. We can talk about the internet and smartphones. All of these are sort of technological examples of the way that change can happen very, very quickly if we can shift the systems to do that, to adopt a new technology. There are also social movement examples and behavioral examples of that as well. And this should, give us some hope that actually, people have been chipping away and campaigning and trying to get change to happen for decades, really, towards sustainability. The fact that it hasn't become mainstream yet, in some regards, it doesn't mean it's doomed to fail. It might just mean it needs more and more pushing until it hits that tipping point. But it's not just about sort of mindlessly pushing and pushing and pushing. There are other things that have to happen within systems for change to come about. So I'm going to tell you about two of those now. So that was tipping points theory. The second little bit from systems change research I want to tell you about is this idea that system change happens because of pressure at multiple levels. So it's not just grassroots campaigns that bring about change, and it's not just top-down government or big business that can generate change. It's actually pressure for change at all levels within the system. So grassroots and campaigning and protesting is a great way to force or convince people at the top level to make changes to legislation or to supply chains or to ways of doing business. But there's also people in the middle, the professionals, the people like us, built environment professionals, architects, planners, developers, who, we can't change legislation and we might not be out protesting or forming community groups, but we have a really important role to play in the professional arena with the projects that we're doing, with the influence that we have in the business world or in the public sector to actually bring about change as well. So I think what I take away from this is that just because you're not a politician, it doesn't mean, or you're not like a CEO of a huge company, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything. We need everyone pushing in the same direction for change, for new behaviors, new norms in our design and planning work, new technologies being adopted, and that it can often seem like there isn't much of a response happening, but we need everyone pushing basically at the same time. So you use whatever sphere of influence you have, and that's how system change occurs. And then the third little takeaway from systems change research with regards to this is this idea of windows of opportunity, which is that if we have, let's say, a new technology or a new behavior, new social innovation that we think should be scaled up and mainstreamed as a sustainability response or as a response to climate change, it often isn't enough that you just have a really good idea or you just have a really good technology. There also needs to be disruptions in the systems taking place that open up windows of opportunity. So these things might be natural disasters, they might be financial shocks, they might be social unrest. These are the big scale changes to society that kind of shock us and force us to adapt and to start to change systems. And when there is good ideas like new technologies or new innovations that are ready to go to fill those windows of opportunity, that's when systems change can happen really quickly. So again, I think the main takeaway just from these 3 points is that everyone can play a role in systems change, even if it feels like you can't make much of a difference. Systems change can happen very quickly and often happens quickly rather than slowly. Although it can take years and decades of slow pushing to get to that transformation, that tipping point, and that there really needs to be some sort of disruption going on often for these social changes to happen. Now, needless to say, we are living in an era of disruption. Okay, natural disasters, climate change, economies struggling, all of these things are starting to open up the conversation towards more transformative or transformations of our systems. And so those are the things that I often think about when it feels like change is happening too slowly. I remind myself that conditions are starting to become really ripe for systems change, and we need to be ready and able to push for systems to change towards more sustainable ends when opportunities arise. Systems change is complex, messy, non-linear. You can't do it yourself, but you can play a role in the wider shifts that are happening. And I think it starts with thinking of yourself as a change maker and owning up to that role and finding your role in systems change, depending on your own strengths, your own levels of influence, and your own place within the systems. So with that bit of background on systems change, I want to tell you about some of the conclusions I've come to from my 80 plus interviews with 120 plus people working within the built environment and pushing for sustainability. From all of that data gathering and all of that analysis, I have come up with this idea of 5 archetypes of change makers that seem to be prevalent across the built environment sectors. So I'm going to tell you what these are, and then I'm going to give you some examples of people who I think sort of fit into these categories. They may not identify themselves, with these exact titles, but this is my own sort of analysis on it. And I'm going to explain a little bit more in depth what each of them mean and how you can start to think whether you fall into one of those categories or whether you might be, in multiple of those categories, and how you can start to leverage that for systems change within your sphere of influence. So here are the 5 types. So the first one is called champion and coordinator. The second one is called researcher and storyteller. The third one is topic expert. The fourth one is innovator. And the fifth one is systems influencer. So yeah, some of these might be, might make sense. Some of them might be a bit like, what's that? So I'll explain just a bit about what each of these mean. And I think some of them will start to resonate with you. The first one is champion and coordinator. So this is someone who is a sociable person, someone who can coordinate a bigger team or coordinate a big network, and who can act as a sustainability champion in their networks. So typically within a professional setting, this would be someone who either is hired or decides to sort of give themselves the role of a sustainability coordinator within their office. And they will talk to their colleagues. They'll work with their colleagues, their teams, their clients to start to implement sustainability across a range of projects. So it's someone who is kind of a central hub for a wider network, and someone who can keep flying the flag for sustainability, pushing for more sustainable design and outcomes, who can share information, who can manage and coordinate different disciplines. And it's typically someone who has quite a good generalist understanding of sustainability. So I've played this role a little bit in my previous job, where I actually gave myself the title with my manager's blessing of climate champion. And that really just meant that I was taking on an extra role as part of my job to really push for more sustainable outcomes in the work that we were doing. And it was quite a useful thing to do. And it really helped me as this sort of central node, working with my colleagues to reorientate some of the work that we were doing towards making sure we were prioritizing sustainability in ways that we hadn't been doing before. So that's the power of a champion and a coordinator. The second one is a researcher and storyteller. So this is someone who loves learning, someone who can, wants to keep finding out and keep researching and reading and listening to podcasts and understanding more and more about sustainability, and then can tell those stories, can inspire other people, can share the information. Someone who can challenge the status quo and show alternatives, create visions for the future that other people maybe haven't considered. So this is a very powerful role. Often these people host podcasts. So obviously I find myself in this role quite a lot as a podcaster, as a speaker, as an educator who goes out and does presentations. I see, this is part of my strengths as someone who loves to learn, can distill things down into understandable chunks of information and then share that with a wider audience. We need more and more people like this. And other examples would be authors. A lot of academics are in this role because they're teaching or they're writing papers. They're trying to influence the wider sector. Another example would be the professional who uses their projects as an opportunity to go beyond the dry technicalities of sustainability, to inspire their clients and the communities that they work with, to look beyond the status quo, to see alternative futures, to drive for more sustainable outcomes and new design approaches. So you don't necessarily need to write a book or start a podcast, but you can do the sort of storytelling and this narrative building and this narrative shifting within your day-to-day job as well. So there's lots of ways into this. And I think the people who find themselves in this role are the people who love learning and can tell stories and like presenting, like being on stage, etc. The third type of change maker that I've identified would be a topic expert. And this one might seem kind of obvious, but this is the people who develop a really deep technical understanding of their subject within sustainability so that they can offer, huge value in the work that they're doing. So if the first two, the champion and coordinator and the researcher and storyteller, were more sort of outward facing roles, the topic expert is a more internal facing role where they're maybe working with a smaller group of people, they're working on their own projects, but they're going really deep and they're offering really, really valuable expertise on the projects that they're doing. So some of you listening might be in this role already. You're the people who often have the word sustainability in your job title. You might be a sustainability engineer, you might be a embodied carbon expert, you might be a circular economy lead, something like that. And I've had lots of these kinds of people on the podcast to share their deep understanding of various aspects of sustainability. I think it's useful to pause and reflect on the fact that I don't think everyone has to be a topic expert. I'm not a topic expert. I'm a sustainability generalist. I try to understand enough about a huge array of topics related to sustainability, but you wouldn't necessarily ask me to do your embodied carbon calculations because it's just not my area of expertise. I haven't done that deep focused work to do that stuff really well, but other people have. And so everyone can play a role, whether you're naturally inclined towards a more deep focus, engineering numbers focus, or you're more into social science and social change and you're interested in looking at the systems and keeping a big picture. There's a role for everyone. Now, the fourth type of change maker that I've identified is an innovator. This is someone who can challenge the status quo, can be on the cutting edge, can come up with new ideas, new types of designs, new solutions that isn't in the mainstream yet and maybe starts in quite a niche way, but has potential to then scale up and become mainstream. The innovators are really, really important. And there's, certain kinds of people who are really, really great at this. And I've had lots of these people on my podcast as well. So I'll give, a couple of examples here. Eco-responsive environments they're a practice who have a book by the same name, and they're pioneering an approach to master planning that is based on an understanding of natural systems. Very innovative, not something that is mainstream, unfortunately, at the moment, but they're trying to show what is possible, do things in a different way, and then, hopefully that can scale up. Another example would be Michael Pollan, who is an author and an architect. He is an innovator in the fields of biomimicry and now more recently regenerative design. So again, he's a topic expert in his subject area, but he's also coming up with new ideas and he's trying to influence the wider industry in that way. Now, the fifth but certainly not final type of change maker is what I call a systems influencer. And these are the people who often work in groups beyond their job, and they're really trying to influence the wider industry through coming together and driving forward new concepts and standards and rules. So there's quite a number of these that have been very successful, particularly in the UK, which is the context I'm most familiar with. I'm sure there are examples around the world as well. I'd give an example of LETI, which started life as the London Energy Transformation Initiative. And as they started to scale beyond London, they became the Low Energy Transformation Initiative, and they operate across the UK now. But they were a group of mostly architects and engineers who saw that there was a need within the industry for new standards and a shared understanding of how we could decarbonize the architecture projects that we're working on. And they really brought together the knowledge of a big group of people that were passionate about this, and they came up with a bunch of standards that they basically proposed to the industry as saying, this is something that we all endorse, we're all behind, and we should all be aiming towards this, and it's all science-backed. And that's been very influential within the UK. It's influencing individual projects in terms of raising the ambition and giving, milestones or targets that people can reach for. Interestingly, it's also starting to influence planning policy. So there's local authorities now who are, willingly adopting the LETI standards in their new planning policy documents, so their local plans. And so that is raising the ambition and the requirements for new development coming forward to reach those good standards of sustainability. So this is a very interesting one, these system influencers. It's often more than one person. It's often a group of people who come together and say, let's combine our thinking. So in that way, it's kind of similar to the champion and coordinator. There's often champions and coordinators working within this, bringing people together. But they're really saying, let's not just deliver good projects ourselves. We need to influence the wider industry, the wider built environment sector, to start delivering better projects overall. So those are the 5 types of change makers that I've identified based on the 120 plus people I've spoken to part of this podcast. I've certainly been inspired by other work in this field. So a UK organisation called Design Council put together a document about systems innovation a couple of years ago. And they came up with this idea that there's 4 characteristics of change makers, and there's different roles that people can play within shifting towards sustainability. And their categories were connector and convener, very similar to one of my categories. Leader and storyteller, very similar to my researcher storyteller. One of them is called systems thinker, and that's similar to my systems influencer one, I suppose. And then the other one is the designer and maker, which is kind of similar to the topic expert or innovator that I've come up with. So that was for the design field more broadly. And I think, that's a great thing to read, and I'll put a link to it in the episode description. I've sort of taken inspiration from that, but adapted it more to the built environment and the kind of, making it a little bit more based on the data that I have in terms of talking to so many people. The other thing to say is that with these 5 categories, often people don't fall neatly into one category. Often people are straddling across categories, or they are, they embody a sort of combination of categories. And I think the people who have the most impact within the sector are actually people who are, stretching across multiple categories. So I'll give an example like topic experts, really important, but I think their impact can be scaled much bigger if they combine that with another one of these archetypes, potentially the researcher and storyteller. So you can imagine if you're a topic expert and you really know what you're talking about in terms of projects, but you're really bad at communicating that, well, that's a problem. You're really limiting your impact with that. So if you can improve your storytelling capabilities, improve your visioning and your communication, then that's a really powerful combination. So don't feel limited to say, oh, I have to sort of fit into a box here. The idea is not to put anyone in boxes, but it's really just to say that there are these established roles that are starting to pop up, and it really depends on what your strengths are, what your interests are, what your level of influence is in terms of your role, your job that you're in, and then just leaning into that, leaning into your strengths, not feeling like you're not knowledgeable enough. to be involved in systems change or not feeling like you're not powerful enough. Everyone can play a role, and you can also jump around these roles. You might start off as a champion and coordinator within your office, but then in doing that, as you do more projects, you might end up becoming more of a topic expert. So I really hope that has resonated with you and you found that interesting and you're starting to reflect on which one of these archetypes you could fit into. If you want to dive into this a bit deeper, learn a bit more about systems change, and actually be guided through a framework for figuring out which archetype you could be, I'm running an online workshop about this topic on the 19th of February. It's at 10:30 Central European time, which is 9:30 UK time. It's 90 minutes long, so it's an hour and a half. And I really recommend you join live and follow along with the workshop. It's kind of an interactive format. If you can't join live, maybe it doesn't work with your time zone, sorry Americans, you can still register and you'll receive the recording afterwards. Have a look in the episode description for the link to the event page. It's on Eventbrite. You can read a bit more about it there and you can register. It's the first link when you open up the description of this episode. Really hope to see you there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on this idea. That's it for this episode. I'll see you next week for another interview with one of these change makers.